Okay, next topic here in the introduction, something we need to talk about before we dive into the later topics of the year, is the scientific method. So there are two broadly different approaches to science. One method is called discovery science. Discovery science is where you start with you do experiments and you start with really careful observation and analysis of data. Data is basically recorded observations, which can be either qualitative or quantitative, meaning you can be describing something or you can be throwing without numbers, or you can be putting numbers on things like weights and times and whatnot. Um, this kind of science uses induction, which gives generalizations based on many, many specific observations. So you're working from the very small to the very large, like a triangle. You start here and you get big generalizations. Now, there are other approaches to science, and the other or opposite approach is hypothesis-based science, which involves proposing and testing hypothetical explanations. So people tend to read, in this approach, you read research others have done, you develop ideas on how you think things work, and you develop a hypothesis from the research you've done, which is a tentative answer to a well-framed question, which must be testable because it makes predictions. This kind of logic is deductive, meaning logic flows from the general to the specific. So here, you're like on a broad plane here, and you're honing down on a specific concept from a broad body of research. The hypotheses gain credibility by surviving attempts to falsify the original hypothesis. So these two kinds of science are both of them go on, both are worthy. It just, which one is being done all depends on what you're doing research in. So discovery tends to be inductive, hypothesis-based is deductive. And really, both are based on what we call the scientific method. The scientific method is the basic way the human brain works. The human brain observes, analyzes, hypothesizes, and then experiments. This is basically the inductive reasoning system at work. That's discovery science here. That's what this is. So let's talk about how this now progresses. Basically, the way this works is somebody makes observations and collects data. So somebody's doing an experiment and they collect data of all types. It could be hearing data, visual data, feeling data, taste or touch. It could be mass, all kinds of different things. Then you have to sit down and analyze the data. You draw graphs. You think about the relationships between the different variables that were involved in the experiment. You use problem-solving thinking patterns to lead to a breakdown of the observations, and mathematical modeling is often used to organize the data into tables and display it on charts, etc. Then you develop a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a summary that explains and predicts. Both of these are important. Hypotheses both explain and predict an outcome. The hypothesis then leads towards the development of an experiment. The person then does an experiment, which is basically a test of the hypothesis. You need two sets of conditions, and in both sets, everything is identical except for one variable. That one variable is the independent variable, and whatever you measure is the dependent variable, the responding variable. So we'll talk more about that as we're doing the labs in the course. Now, the big ideas, it says developing big ideas in science. Thousands of individual experiments produce ideas about how intangible things work. Okay? Hypothesis-based science develops new hypotheses through discovery science. In other words, ultimately, if you're going to sit down and talk about like broadly accepted theories and then decide on how to try and explain something as specific as how an organelle works in a cell, ultimately you're going to have to test your idea. So the discovery-based and the hypothesis-based science actually mesh with each other, but they have different initial approaches. After a whole lot of scientific discussion and experimentation, theories come out. And basically, a theory is a broad explanation, much broader than a hypothesis. It's general enough to produce often many new hypotheses. It's supported by a much more massive body of evidence than a hypothesis, and it's basically an explanation for something that is not self-evident. To help describe theories, we use models to show the interaction of the different parts. The model itself is not directly observable often in the real world, like a picture of a cell. But the components of the model are barely visible sometimes, and sometimes they're not. It depends, like the components of an atom cannot be directly observed, only their effects, like electrons. We cannot see individual electrons, but we can see the effect of electrons, like the flow of electricity and its like conversion to make light bulbs work. Next, examples of common models are the current ideas of global climate change, the cell, the atom, etc. So we're going to be talking about, we'll use the scientific method throughout the lab phase of AP Biology. And so we'll put a whole lot of this into practice as the course goes on.